Welcome to my presentation. My name is Connor Gray, and I'm a developer on our engine connectivity team here at Wolfram Research. And today I'm going to be talking about some tools for developing Paclets, which have been put into the system starting in Wolfram Language version 13. What are Paclets? Now, I know many of you may have attended Todd Gailey and Bob Sandheinrich's talk this morning, which was covering Paclets in the Paclet Repository. With this talk, I'm going to be sort of walking you through as sort of a developer's perspective on Paclets. So if you want to create a Paclet, start filling out content, see what operations you can do on Paclets, see how you can use Paclets, this is going to be kind of a guided tour through the developer experience of working on Paclets. So it's going to be pretty hands-on. Now, just to start, again, a high-level overview, what are Paclets? So Paclets are they're bundles of files which extend the Wolfram system with new functionality. Now that functionality primarily takes the form of new code, but can also be new documentation, new front-end features like palettes and menu items. A lot of the functionality which you see in the Wolfram system as you use it, day to day, is actually implemented as Paclets. Things are broken up into Paclets within the system. Starting with 13, we're introducing sets of tools which allow you to develop new Paclets more easily yourself as users. Many of you may know or be familiar with functionality that was in the Wolfram Workbench IDE environment, which has been available for a long time. Forgot to mute my phone. Sorry about that. Just put that off the side. So the functionality. Why is this not, okay, sorry about that. So functionality for writing documentation and building documentation has been available in the Workbench for a long time. Starting in 13, that functionality is now in the system for everybody to use. So one of the things that is new in 13 is the DocumentationTools package, which we'll be talking about, and the PacletTools package, which provides functionality for operating on Paclets from sort of a mid-level developer point of view. So one of the main functions provided by PacletTools is a function called create Paclet. Just resize this a bit. So create Paclet is a very convenient way of creating a new directory structure to contain your Paclet content. So you can use it by loading the PacletTools package and evaluating the create Paclet command. Now the create Paclet command, it takes the first argument, which is the name of the Paclet which you're going to be creating, an argument which is the directory in which you want to create that Paclet, and then it takes options which allow you to specify certain things about that Paclet. I happen to have put this option in here because I need to, the Paclet we're creating today, and I'm going to be demoing, I happen to need to open it in version 12.3. So if I run this, we're going to see over here, a new file is going to pop up on my desktop, or a new directory, I should say, which contains the contents of my Paclet. And if I open up this Paclet in the operating system's Finder window, I can see that it's filled in some content for me automatically. Now, the primary thing which indicates that this directory is a Paclet is this Paclet info file. So a Paclet info file is the programmatic description of what a Paclet is and the functionality that it provides. So by default, create Paclet is going to have generated a fairly typical standard set of options specifying this Paclet. The first one is this name field, which is pretty straightforward. It's just the name of this Paclet. Now this name needs to be unique. Something which some of you who may already be familiar with Paclets may see is new here is this prefix with a double underscore in front of the sort of base name of the Paclet. This is something which indicates the identity or of the person who is creating this Paclet, what we're calling the publisher ID. This is necessary for Paclets which are uploaded to our upcoming Wolfram Paclet Repository, which will be a place where anybody can publish their Paclets for other people to use. This is necessary to disambiguate names and make it explicit who the author of a particular Paclet is. But this, if I have several Paclets, this prefix will be common in the name of all of them, and it's the base name after that prefix, which is sort of the more descriptive name of what that Paclet actually contains. The next item, which is common and which will become common as people begin to write Paclets for the Wolfram Paclet Repository, is this publisher ID key. This is just more explicitly that the name of the publisher who is the author of this Paclet. And you can see, there's a symbol in the system called $publisher ID, which is the name of the person who's publishing the Paclet. In this case, that's me. Next up, we can see this file specifies a version for a Paclet. This is just a number which identifies different releases of Paclet functionality. It's starting off very low, but over time, as you release new versions of the Paclet, you should increment this. If you make a major change or backwards incompatible change, you should increment this first version number. Feature things should increment the second version number, and this last version is just for minor bug fixes and changes. But this number is important for signifying what, sort of semantically what changes from one release of a Paclet to the next. The last piece of metadata here that we're going to talk about is the Wolfram version key. Now this just signifies what versions of the system that our Paclet is compatible with. For example, if you're, say a new version of the Wolfram language comes out that has a great new function you want to use and you use it in your Paclet, it's important that you specify the version of the Wolfram language that that function is provided by, so that your Paclet is only loadable in compatible versions of the Wolfram language, so that people running older versions of the Wolfram language don't accidentally load your Paclet and wonder, hey, it's using this function which doesn't exist. So this is just a way to declare what versions of the Wolfram language your Paclet is compatible with. So now we're going to kind of get into the meat of a Paclet, which is this extensions field. So this is where you actually declare how your Paclet adds new content to the system, what functionality it adds. By default, this Paclet info file is the only thing that's considered part of your Paclet. The extensions field is where you specify what additional files, what additional content should be considered part of the Paclet that you're writing. Now, the most common type of extension is going to be the kernel extension. This is the extension which tells the system about code that you've written. So these are .wl files which contain Wolfram language code. We can see that this extension tells the system that this Paclet contains this kernel directory which contains this mypaclet.wl file. Drilling down into that a bit, the root option on the kernel extension specifies what the directory that content for this extension is contained in. Conventionally, that directory should be called kernel. We can see that reflected in the directory structure here. Now you can specify other names. Some people happen to call this source. Historically, this actually, the name for this was dot, which signifies the root directory of the Paclet, because it was common historically for the files, the language, the Wolfram language files in a Paclet to be in the root directory of the Paclet. Starting with the Wolfram Paclet Repository and this set of Paclet related functionality we're releasing in 13, we're going to be requiring that, or encouraging that new Paclets place their source files in an explicit subdirectory, that they don't sit in the root directory of the Paclet. And that is a requirement, not for all Paclets, but only for Paclets which are uploaded to the public Wolfram Paclet Repository. So the next option on the kernel extension that we care about is this context key. Now this is where we actually tell the system how we want this code to plug into it. So this context key has the way that tells the system. So the context key, it tells the system about a context which is provided. It is a named set of code which is provided by your Paclet. Now, historically, the very common form of this key that you see looks like this, where you just have context on the left side of the rule and a context name on the right side. And that will map to a file simply based on the name of the context. Now, because we're expecting that many Paclets are going to be written for the Wolfram Paclet Repository, and one of the requirements of the Wolfram Paclet Repository is that the context provided by your package be prefixed. So you can see here, instead of having a single context component, just my Paclet backtick, you're required to have an additional context component, which is equal to your publisher ID. Now, this ensures that the code provided by your Paclet is always namespaced to a name that is sort of unique to you as a publisher. So one of the, for compatibility with versions of the Wolfram language prior to 13, it happens to be necessary to manually, if you have multiple context components, you need to specify the name of the file which that context is associated with. Now, if your Paclet is only being used in version 13, you can use this form, and version 13 has logic to allow you to omit that, or you can include this publisher ID prefix without having to do anything special. For versions prior to 13, you do need to specify an explicit mapping between the context and the file which provides that context. So next up, this is the second extension, which is provided by default by Create Paclet, because these are hopefully very common, documentation. So again, Paclets can provide code. They can also provide documentation, which hooks up to the system's documentation browser. And this means that when you write a Paclet that contains functionality, you can document it using the tools we provide, and your users will be able to read that documentation and learn about your Paclet and what it can do. So if we have documentation extension, we obviously want to be able to write documentation. So again, starting in 13, there's this new documentation tools palette, which I'm going to open up now. It's off screen, but I'll open this from the system's palettes menu. And we'll see over here, pop up this new palette. Now, by default, I guess I've already configured this, but there will be a button here that says Add Paclet. So we have to tell the documentation tools palette where your new Paclet lives. I happen to have already added it. It knows about this directory on my desktop here. So the first thing that we want to do when we're documenting a Paclet is document the functions that our Paclet provides. Our Paclet happens to, by default, contain, because we used Create Paclet, it's filled out the contents of that Paclet with some default contents, some default code. And this is the sort of the standard way of defining a Wolfram language package. We have these begin package and end package statements, which sort of bookend the content of the package. Now, this topic I'm not going to cover in a whole lot of detail. I assume that many of you will be familiar with writing Wolfram language packages, and there are tutorials in the system for covering sort of this set of conventions. But I do want to point out that there happens to be this say hello function built in, which is what we're going to document in this demo. So if I click this, if I go back to the documentation tools palette and I click this new function page button, we're going to see, if I open up, I have this documentation directory viewable here. If I click the new function page button, it will pop up a dialog asking what I want the name of my function to be. I'm going to say we're going to document the say hello function. I'll go ahead and click OK. And you can see it's added some new folders here, and it has popped up a notebook which we can write our documentation into. So there are a couple of things I want to point out about the content of this documentation notebook. First of all is this categorization section at the top. We have metadata which indicates that this is a symbol documentation page, that the thing we're documenting is a symbol. Metadata indicating the Paclet which this documentation comes from, the context which this symbol comes from, and most importantly, this unique identifier, which is how we can refer to or search for this documentation in the system once we've loaded it. So I'm going to do a very brief demo now on how, sort of how you write a basic documentation page. Tomorrow, Brian Vandertlew, who works on our documentation team and is really the expert on these tools, is also going to be doing a presentation covering in a bit more detail sort of this documentation tools palette and conventions around writing documentation. But at a very basic level, a simple documentation page has a usage message. Now, I happen to know this symbol will print a greeting message for the name of the person you provide as an argument. So I'm just going to write in that text here, and then I'm going to write in the what we call a template parameter, which is the name of the sort of meant to indicate the argument in this function. So we're sort of describing the structure of the arguments that this function can take. And what I'll do is give this template parameter a special style using this template input button. If I click that, it will pop up this dialog window, just asking if I want to format that as a link to something or just as just pure formatting, no linking. I just want this to be formatted, so I'll go ahead and click OK, and we can see it's turned into this little sort of italicized parameter. Now, because I'm referencing the name of that parameter in this message, I'm going to do this likewise here. I'm going to hit template input, and I'll get the same dialog. I'll hit OK, and we'll see that pop up. So in addition to having usage messages, documentation hopefully always contains examples. Actually, before I go to examples, I should mention, in addition to the usage messages, it has a note section, which typically describes in a bit more detail sort of the method that function uses, maybe a bit more detail about how it works or what it returns or potential options on the function. And that's what that section here, right before the usage section, is for. This is what we call the details and options section. So I could write in a simple message here saying, say hello of name uses print to display a greeting message. So this is just, I'm just giving a little bit more detail about what this function does. Again, our standard style is that any reference to a function name or a parameter in the documentation should have this template input style. So I'm going to select this sort of example code that I just wrote and hit template input, and it's going to go ahead and there it goes. It turned the name of the function into a link, which in the build documentation you'll be able to click, and it turned that parameter into a stylized parameter name. Likewise, because I'm referencing the name of a system function here in my notes message, I also want to template input that, so that turns into a link. So I'll go ahead and hit template input, and that's going to turn into a link to the system print function. If I click that, it opens up the documentation for print. So that's a basic usage message. Now I can write a very simple example. It's important that you have examples to your documentation so people know how to use the functions. Now, because this is a symbol provided by my package, the first thing I'm going to do is load my code so I can use it. And that's that context we saw earlier, Connor Gray, backtick my Paclet. I'll type that in, and that'll load it. Next, I'm going to call that say hello function, and I'll say my audience. If I run this, I get a very simple example of what my function can do. So now I've written a piece of documentation. Now, many of you have probably noticed this documentation looks fairly different from the documentation which is built into the system. And that's because this is what we call an authoring notebook. This is where you can write the documentation, but it isn't documentation isn't distributed in this form. It goes through a build process. So what we're going to do next is build this documentation into that what we call the in product form. That's the sort of more pretty stylized form of documentation. So I'll go to my next slide here. So it's meant to be closed. So one of the Paclet tools functions in version 13 is Paclet Documentation Build, which provides functionality necessary, or it provides the logic necessary to build an authoring notebook into, again, one of these more stylized documentation notebooks. So if I run Paclet Documentation Build over my new Paclet, we're going to see it's going to work for a minute, and it's going to create this build directory in my Paclet, and it's going to place the built documentation in the appropriate subdirectory of this build directory. One thing I'll point out is that in addition to copying or building this say hello file, it's also added these spell index and search index and index directories. These are what actually contain the search index data, which is necessary to, make it possible to type in a search term that appears in your documentation and have the right page come up. So I can open up this build page and pop up off screen, but here I can drag it in, and we can see this is a more typical more typical documentation page where you have the nice stylized usage message detail section and that basic example that we wrote. So you can see it's fairly easy to go through the process of taking one of the functions from your package, making a new documentation page, building it, seeing how it looks, moving on to the next one. So we're hopeful that this will make it very easy for people to document their functionality, and lots of people will do that, and we'll have a nice collection of well-documented Paclets. And obviously, Paclet developers will be happy that they can use these tools to make it easier for their users to use the functionality that they provide. So one thing I want to mention is a bit of a side note, but oftentimes if you have a large package which has a lot of a lot of symbols and a lot of documentation pages, you may desire, if you're editing a particular page, you may want to be able to just rebuild that individual page. The functionality for that exists. It doesn't happen to be exposed through Paclet Documentation Build, but if you do want to be able to build just a single file, ignoring the rest of them, you can dip into the lower level documentation build package, and we can load this and use a function basically to filter the set of files which are going to be built by this run. So here I'm just saying, I'm asking it to please only build the files that are called say hello. But if you are writing documentation, you're working on a page, you could just put in whatever name of the symbol you're working on that you want to rebuild and specify that there. I'm going to run this documentation build notebooks function. Now this is going to turn out pretty similarly as just using Paclet Documentation Build, because obviously in our example Paclet, we've only got one symbol. But again, it's not uncommon for you to have dozens or hundreds of symbols where you may really want to be able to just build one instead of building all of them, which is where using this may be useful. So next up, one thing that you may notice is that using Paclet Documentation Build, we got this documentation directory in our build output our build directory, but we don't have the rest of the content of our Paclet. We don't have the Paclet info file, and we don't have the code. And that's where a function called Paclet Build comes in. Now, Paclet Build is a slightly higher level, more general tool for building Paclets. Now, Paclet Build will use Paclet Documentation Build to build the documentation in your Paclet, but it also does the filtering necessary to ensure that only files which are declared in your Paclet info file end up in the built Paclet. And you may care about that because it's fairly common to be in a situation where, say, here I can do a quick little example. If I go into this, if I go into my Paclet here, and maybe I have, say, a scripts subdirectory in my Paclet. This is fairly common. You have a build script or a script to scrape some data. Oops, that's what I meant to do. Something like that. That in my Paclet. You may not want this directory to be included in your built Paclet. And that's where Paclet Build comes in. Paclet Build will only copy the files which are declared in the extensions key of your Paclet info file. That is, again, this data here. So that in our Paclet, that happens to be the kernel and documentation extension. If we build our Paclet, so I'll run this. I'll run this command here. And it's going to go ahead. First, it's going to rebuild the documentation, but you can see it's also copied in that kernel directory. And it's copied in the Paclet info file. And it's also built this .paclet file. Now, a .paclet file is an archive of all of the contents of your Paclet. So it's got the kernel code, it's got the documentation, it's got the Paclet info file. It's got all the things you want in your Paclet, but crucially, it doesn't contain that scripts directory because we didn't declare in any way that should be included in our Paclet. So it's sorry, somebody's calling API. Thought I muted that. So Paclet Build is very handy if you have files in your Paclet directory which you don't really want to have picked up, or you have documentation you want to build. This will be a very common tool to use. So I've got this Paclet, I've got some content, I've got some code. How do I get it into the system? Well, the simplest way is by installing that .paclet file. Now this is a file, it's got all the content, so you can email it to your friends or colleagues. You can share it, through any kind of file sharing service. Once they get it onto their computer, all you have to do is use Paclet Install. I've already installed this Paclet, so I'll uninstall it real quick. Actually, I know. I have to, yeah. Navigate to that directory. Paclet. Oh, why did that not work? Again. Okay, now it's uninstalled. So I can install it anew from that file. And now it's live in my system. So for example, I can do what I did earlier. I can load it. And I can use that function. Or I can view the documentation that's in my Paclet. Now, the way I do that is navigating to the system's documentation center. So if I open this up, here I have the system's documentation center. And I can search for the say hello function that I wrote, that documentation page, and it's going to pop up. And this will work for any pages that I write. I might have a guide page. I could search for the name of my Paclet. And we'll see here symbols from my Paclet pop up in this search results listing. So again, this means that if you write a Paclet that has functionality and documentation, and you share it with your friends or colleagues, they can very easily navigate to the documentation you wrote and begin using it, just as if it was a built-in, piece of documentation written by us at Wolfram Research. So you can really have a first-class experience distributing your code and functionality. So nearing the end, but I have just a couple more things to show. One thing I wanted to mention is that you obviously, if you build a Paclet and you upload it to our Wolfram, the upcoming public Wolfram Paclet repository, which is not releasing with 13, but will be coming in within a few months, it will be public. But there are situations where you may want to have a Paclet that you share, say, with only a couple of friends or colleagues privately. And you can do that by uploading your documentation not to the Wolfram Paclet repository, but simply to a cloud destination that you control. And you can do that using Paclet Documentation Build, which supports a second argument, which is the destination. This can be a directory on your computer if you just want to build it locally, or it can be a cloud object directory. So if I run this, oops, I forgot to load PacletTools again. Oops. Oops, just moving back. Load PacletTools again. And I run my build function. Oops. Yeah, there it goes. Again. Why did that not work? Try that one more time. Run that, run that. Okay, now it's thinking. So this is building my documentation and it's up. Why did, oh, I know why. This Paclet directory variable is not defined. So I'll evaluate that. Now I can build it. There we go. So it's building those notebooks and it's deploying them to this cloud directory. And once this finishes, it will show us the link, which I can click. And this opened up in my browser. We've got that documentation page. I can see the details. I can see the examples. And it's all the content is there. Now, crucially, I happen to have specified permissions public. So any of you could go see this if you wanted. But this is just a cloud object. You can specify whatever permissions you want, maybe just one friend or a group of colleagues, whoever, and they'll be able to view your documentation. Now this is a bit lower level, but I do want to mention what's happened here in this first example is we've built a notebook and then we've deployed that notebook to the cloud as if it was any other notebook. It happens to be the case that the documentation on the normal sort of system documentation on the web goes through a slightly different process. It builds directly to HTML, and then those HTML files are deployed to the web. And you could do that as well by specifying this third argument to Paclet documentation build, which specifies the format of the documentation to build. But you can, again, likewise specify a cloud object directory to use. So if I go ahead and run this, it'll take a little longer because it has to copy not only a notebook file, but some JavaScript and CSS assets. So we'll let this think. But the one difference between the sort of deploying a notebook and deploying HTML is that there are certain sort of features implemented in JavaScript for web documentation, which differ slightly from notebook documentation. But I can click on this and open it up, and you can see I have my HTML page built documentation. So for those of you who are interested in building HTML, you know, it's also useful to be able to build HTML if you want to deploy documentation, say, to your own private web server, for example. This is one way that you can do that. So that's basically my whirlwind tour of developing Paclets and sort of what the workflow is of a Paclet developer. I do want to mention that, again, there was a talk this morning done by Todd Gailey and Bob Sandheinrich, which covers a bit more details about how Paclets work and talks about, again, the Wolfram Paclet Repository, which will be coming in the near future. And what, you know, their talk covers specifically the process of writing a Paclet to the Paclet repository and uploading it, and sort of all the details though. So I encourage you to go and watch the recording of their talk, which is available at this link, or if you want to scan the barcode. I'll also mention that Brian Van Vertlew, who again works on our documentation team, is doing a presentation tomorrow, I believe. Check what time, covering a bit more details about writing documentation, styling, those kinds of things. So that concludes the presentation portion of my talk. Are there any questions? Let me see. Okay, someone asks, is the Wolfram workbench still required for documentation building? The answer is no. All of the functionality for building documentation, which was in the Wolfram workbench, has been moved into the system now. You can still use the Wolfram workbench, but I think the developer experience of calling, you know, one of these Paclet documentation build functions from a notebook is much nicer than opening up the workbench and going through that process. You can now work fully within the system. You don't have to use that external development environment. Let's see. There was one other question, but it looks like it's been answered in chat, so I won't bother answer that. So I think that that basically concludes my talk. If there are any more questions, feel free to keep posting them in chat. I'll answer them that way. There's also going to be, I think we're going to do a sort of a Q&A kind of session tomorrow. I believe it's been discussed at 2 p.m. Check the conference agenda for when that actually gets scheduled. So thanks everyone for coming, and I'll hopefully talk to some of you later. Bye.